Israel has prevailed, substantially prevailed in each case. But Israel does not have the same, let's say, political warfare power as it does military warfare. We have to keep fighting, we have to keep resisting this.
Hello everyone and welcome to NGO Monitor's podcast. NGO Monitor is a research organization based in Jerusalem with a simple mission that is difficult to attain these days, and that is defending Israel's right to exist within the human rights space. Today, joining us is the spectacular Richard Kemp, former commander in British Army with a lavishing military career of 29 years in the army, where you served in places ranging from Bosnia to Iraq, and you managed international terror and counter-terror operations there. A name that everyone nowadays knows, but also a member of NGO Monitor's International Advisory Board, so pretty dear to us. Thank you for joining us today and for sharing some of your thoughts.
My pleasure, good to be with you.
Obviously, you know, we were going to talk about how the civil society, the NGOs, and the human rights community vilifies Israel, but we are a day and a half after the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, so we cannot not address this. The most burning issue today in media everywhere around the world is whether US and Israel airstrikes have actually destroyed the Iranian nuclear program. Did they damage it partially or entirely, and whether to what extent have we caused the damage to the Iranian nuclear program? And I want to maybe reframe the question to you. Is that the main question? Was that the main threat, existential threat to Israel? Or is it a broader geopolitical question that also begs the political component to it? What do you think?
Well, the main threat to Israel for many years now has been Iran, and not just Iranian nuclear, although predominantly the potential for Iran to gain a nuclear capability, but also Iran's aggression using its proxies around the region, and now direct attack against Israel since last year. That's the main threat, and it's been severely undermined now. It's not going to be removed completely until this current regime falls, if it does. And then only, of course, if it's replaced by a more reasonable regime that doesn't have Israel in its crosshairs, and the other Arab countries around the region as well. But the damage done, I'm sure, we don't know the details, we don't know exactly the assessment yet, and probably no one does really, but the damage caused has been absolutely immense. There can be no question about that. People talk about it set it back by 2 years, it set it back a little bit, they've still got some uranium. I don't believe that. I believe it's done pretty much irreparable damage, and Iran, if it decides to do so, will have to rebuild its nuclear capability almost from scratch. It does have the knowledge, it's proven to have the knowledge because it's come close to being able to build a bomb. But a lot of that knowledge also has been taken away from it by the killing of Iranian nuclear scientists. Not necessarily totally, but to a significant extent. So the regime will have to, if it chooses to, will have to probably start, not quite from scratch, but almost. And the next, I think probably even more significant point is what this war has done to Iran. For years, Iran has been stringing the US along, stringing the West along, going through bogus negotiations with confidence that it's not going to get attacked. And I don't believe it thought it would be attacked when it was by Israel and then by the United States. But now it knows both US and Israel are willing to take military action against it. And that must figure, I think, quite highly in its calculations as to whether to start this program again, and if so, when. And I think, I would guess, that the Iranian Ayatollahs will have come to the conclusion, or may come to the conclusion, that it's not worth doing this now, with Trump in the White House, with Netanyahu in the Prime Minister's office here in Israel. That I think, as a minimum, they will want to run the clocks down on those two individuals who they're clearly shown the willingness to attack, and maybe see what happens after that before moving forward.
You've been actually here in Israel during the last 12 days of the attack. As an expert, tell us how you felt the entire war was dealt with, not only in terms of the military operation in Iran and obviously the coordination on an international level, but also internally in Israel. I think it's a unique perspective that you can bring to the table as a non-Israeli, right?
Yeah, I think Israel carried out the most extraordinarily effective military operations against Iran, both from the air and to a limited extent on the ground. And I think it shocked a lot of people, the precision of Israel's operations, the level of intelligence penetration of Iran that enabled it to target specific individuals and essentially take out a large chunk of the upper echelons of Iranian military structure. And I think this is the result of, I know this is the result of years and years of planning, detailed planning in Israel, preparations, rehearsals, huge investment in intelligence in Iran, inside Iran, to an extent that probably most of us will never know about. And then on the other side of the coin, we've seen the Iranian weakness. Iran, which was thought to be a major military power in the region, has shown itself to be not much different to a paper tiger. It's fired over 500, I'm not sure the number exactly, ballistic missiles into Israel. About 80 or 90% of that was intercepted either in the air before they entered Israel airspace or before they impacted in Israel. And you know, that of course, let's not forget, that wasn't just done by Israel. It was done mainly by Israel, but with support from the US, both US aircraft, US warships, and of course US missile interceptors based here inside Israel. So that's actually a pretty phenomenal achievement. And yes, there was an impact. I hesitate to say this, but it was a minimum impact. The reason I hesitate to say it is because about 28 people, I think, lost their lives. Quite a large number more were wounded, and many buildings were destroyed because, of course, Iran targeted the civilian population, which is, of course, something that, you know, that those people who are constantly accusing Israel of war crimes pretty much ignored that reality. But nevertheless, despite the tragedy of those deaths and woundings, the strategic impact on Israel was minimal. And that was because of Israel's extraordinary air defense system, but also one other factor, which I think is of strategic importance, which is Israel's sophisticated warning and shelter system. Without that, probably thousands would have died in the attack, even though, you know, there weren't a huge number of impact. It could have killed a lot more people if it hadn't been for that incredibly effective system. So you've now got Israel proven itself to be an extremely powerful military entity, which most people knew anyway, and Iran, a very, very weak body, a very, very weak regime, which I think, if anything, will encourage, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's reasonable to assume it might well encourage oppositionist groups within Iran to exploit that weakness in due course and possibly overthrow the regime.
I'm glad that you brought it up, because you say all those accusing Israel of committing war crimes and not adhering to the international law. On one hand, we have this phenomenal military operation, right, that everyone is praising, wherever they stand on the political spectrum vis-a-vis Israel. But at the same time, and we see the global discourse shifting almost automatically right back onto Gaza, and we are back to the typical slurs of genocide libel, apartheid libel, starvation libel. It almost went unnoticed that while the operation was still ongoing and the missiles from Iran were targeting Israeli civilians, the EU foreign ministers sat down to revise the EU's association agreement with Israel over Article 2, which is the human rights article, and most of the analysis dealt with Gaza and spoke about the dire humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that Israel is not addressing. And you just returned actually from Gaza, where you had a chance uniquely to visit the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is distributing humanitarian aid in coordination with the Israeli government and IDF, and is uniquely allowed to do so, right? It has been met with tremendous opposition from the UN agencies, and at the same time, the entire international community, we just continues to toe the line with the UN. And we know that the UN has allowed systematic stealing, right, theft of humanitarian aid. Can you share some of your experiences? What have you learned there? And do you believe that this can be potentially a new model for humanitarian solution, right, in Gaza? Because it surpasses food, obviously, moving forward.
Yeah, I visited a few days ago the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, one of their aid distribution sites inside Gaza. And before I tell you what I saw, I'll just explain the concept of the GHF. And that is, as you mentioned, up until now, most humanitarian aid that's gone into Gaza has been seized by Hamas and other terrorist and criminal gangs, and then used by Hamas for their own purposes, with the remainder being sold at premium costs to the Gazan people. So people haven't had free aid, they've had aid that they've had to pay for, free aid that's been given to them, but they've had to pay for it. And that has achieved two things for Hamas very effectively. One is to control the civilian population, because the people that control food in particular control the population. And secondly, to provide money from the sale of this aid to Hamas for its terrorist purposes, to pay their terrorists, to recruit more terrorists, and to use whatever else they need to pay for. And that, of course, has helped prolong the war. Both of those two things have helped prolong this war. And the idea of the GHF is to deliver aid directly to the people that need it without that aid getting into Hamas's hands. And I think, from what I've seen and from what I've understood of the GHF's operations, it's extraordinarily successful. It's not perfect, and the GHF doesn't pretend it's perfect. Nothing can be perfect in a situation of chaos like Gaza, but it is, I think, a very effective model. And when I was there in this one humanitarian site for about 2 hours. I was there a bit longer, but in the 2-hour period, during the 2-hour period that I was there, something like 20,000 Gazans came in to collect aid, which was essentially, it was boxes of aid in rows, which had been delivered by 20 trucks, so a significant amount of aid. And over a 2-hour period, they came and got it. It wasn't, if anyone saw the operation, they wouldn't think it was very orderly, and it wasn't. How could you have an orderly, it's like, it'd be like opening a supermarket in Tel Aviv, opening the doors and saying, everything in here is free, come and help yourself. You can imagine what would happen, and that's what happens inside this base. But one of the GHF's, I think, aims is to avoid confrontation, particularly physical confrontation, between their staff who are running this base, and that essentially they're a combination of armed former American servicemen and local Gazan civilians who are affected with the interface between the GHF and the people coming to collect the aid. And they don't want confrontation, so they have to allow that there's limited control they can put on it. But nevertheless, in the time I was there, most people seemed to be, they arrived, they collected the aid they wanted, they left. It wasn't, some of them will have got more than they should have got, others will have got less than they should have got, but like I said, it's not a perfect operation.
Have you had a chance to speak to any of the Gazans who actually came to collect the aid?
I probably spoke to about 50 or more Gazans during the period I was there, and they were very happy. All of them had, pretty much all of them had smiling faces. They were happy, they were getting aid, in many cases for the first time, free aid. And I heard things like, I love America, I love Trump. And that's because, of course, they associate rightly these aid bases with the United States. It's largely a United States private initiative. Also, the other cries I heard frequently from some of these people were, kill Hamas, get rid of Hamas, all of that sort of stuff. And some of the ones I spoke to, and by the way, when they said kill Hamas, those people nearby who heard it were cheering at that. The people I spoke to, I asked, who do you blame for the situation you're in Gaza? And of course they said the Jews. Obviously the Jews are to blame. But probably even more strongly, Hamas is to blame. they said, some of them said to me that the situation in Gaza needed to be changed before the 7th of October, but Hamas did it totally the wrong way, and it's brought destruction and doom onto them. So there is a lot of undercurrent of anti-Hamas feeling among the people I spoke to. Don't know if that will translate into any kind of practical action against Hamas. We've seen some protests and some uprisings against Hamas, but I think they've been, to a large extent, crushed. The other common thing that people said to me is, we want to get out of Gaza. There's no future in Gaza. We want to leave as soon as we possibly can. And who can blame them for that? Right. Despite the fact the international community seems to want them to stay there. They want to go. There have been, as I think you mentioned, there have been a lot of opposition to the GHF since they began operations. And interestingly and starkly, that the two main opponents of the GHF are, one, Hamas, they hate it, and two, the United Nations. Now that tells a story itself. The UN and Hamas speaking effectively in unison. And I was told by some of these Gazans, ordinary civilians and some of the staff working for the Gazan staff working for GHF, that they are under enormous threat from Hamas if they come and collect aid. They need the aid so much that they're willing to take that risk, but they are threatened by the GHF. They're not threatened by Israel, they're not threatened by the IDF for collecting aid. They recognize, well, I don't know if they recognize it, but I know for sure that the IDF, operating in coordination with the GHF, they support it, they enable GHF activities in Gaza. So what possible reason would they have for, as is alleged, for them shooting Gazans coming to collect aid at GHF locations? But of course, Hamas have every reason, every motivation. They want this stopped. And if anyone, I haven't seen any shootings, I don't have any specific information about them apart from what's in the media. But from what I know about the IDF and from what I know about Hamas, if anyone is shooting Gazan civilians coming to get aid, it's going to be Hamas.
So I often say that, I mean, I've been reading the news in the last couple of days, and this morning we only read that there are incoming evidence that Hamas is yet again stealing humanitarian aid, and the Israeli government has now ordered a review and report in the next 48 hours. And yet the only voices coming out of the international community, and that is Brussels and the the EU, right, the European Union, the different member states, obviously all UN agencies, they keep clinging to the official UN line, referring to the same reports, referring to the International Court of Justice, and to bring it closer to home, right, to NGO Monitor. All of these are echoing and directly referencing Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and an array of Palestinian NGOs, many of whom have affiliation with PFLP, Hamas, and other designated terror groups. How do we change this paradigm in which we have a situation in which you just came back out of Gaza? I've never been there. You saw firsthand that IDF is not starving the people and is not even interfering too much, right, with the distribution of aid. And yet, at the backbone of that, we have Israeli soldiers being persecuted, right, in The Hague, and an attempt to impose an arms embargo against Israel, all spearheaded by the same NGOs claiming to promote human rights and protect the people who you say wish to leave Gaza. How do we break this paradigm and shift it into a more critical conversation? Should EU facilitate a reform of the United Nations instead of just echoing continuously the agency that, as you said, is siding with Hamas?
Well, the EU is not going to facilitate the reform of the UN. The EU and the UN are very often in lockstep, and they're both operating under the same narrative, the anti-Israel narrative, which has been building since the 1960s and has got almost total control over the international narrative in many media organizations, in the UN, in the EU, in Amnesty International, in Human Rights Watch, all of these organizations, university campuses. To unlock that is incredibly difficult. I would just, before I say one other thing, I would just mention that I've been into Gaza several times before this. I've been in with the IDF. I've observed the IDF's operations. I know for sure from everything I've seen, obviously I haven't seen everything, but from everything I have seen, the IDF is doing its level best in very difficult circumstances, very dangerous circumstances, to achieve, I think, 4 things. 1, to destroy Hamas and remove Hamas from control of Gaza. 2, to minimize the deaths of innocent civilians inside Gaza, to an extent unprecedented in warfare, from my observations. 3, to achieve, and this isn't necessarily in priority order, but 3, to get as many of the hostages back as possible, if not all of them, and to avoid any action that will result in the deaths of hostages. And 4, of course, something that's very often forgotten, but is absolutely right, to minimize the deaths of Israeli soldiers inside Gaza. Their lives are just as important as anybody else's. And so with those different, I think those different considerations, the IDF has done an extraordinary job, an absolutely extraordinary job. I think it's taken a long time, and the reason it's taken a long time to achieve that first objective of destroying Hamas is because of those other 3 factors, as well as pressure from the Biden administration to slow down on the operations. But it's certainly the case that the lies that you hear in the ICC, in the ICJ, and these are absolutely disgraceful slanders against Israel, threatening legal action with no foundation, absolutely no foundation. It's incredibly difficult to dislodge this narrative that you get, and it's promoted by threatened legal action. People think the ICC and the ICJ are actually, honourable and legitimate institutions. They're not. They've both objective. Yeah. You're right. They've both breached their own charters and their own. In the ICC's case, they've breached their mandate significantly, and that is a powerful weapon against Israel when people, and the United Nations, of course, people think the UN is objective, fair. No, but it isn't. It's far from that. I've experienced the UN many times, particularly in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And that's added to by our political leaders, by people like Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, imposing a partial arms embargo on Israel. By doing that, what he's saying, if he says we can't supply arms to one of our allies, which we've historically supplied arms to, and they even more to us, they're using them, we can't supply them because they're using them to commit war crimes. That's what he's saying, and it's completely false, and he knows it's false. He knows what's going on over here. He's got people over here, he's got diplomats, intelligence personnel,
so why is he
attachés.
Doing it?
He's doing it for one reason, and it's the same motivation as when he says, I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu, I asked him to minimize civilian. He knows Netanyahu's doing everything he can to minimize civilian death. He's doing it not for foreign policy reasons, not for reasons of principle, he's doing it for domestic policy reasons, because he knows within his electorate there are huge numbers of people who hate Israel, really do hate Israel, and you see them out on the streets pretty much every week in London. You see them at university campuses protesting against Israel, basically supporting Hamas. And he obviously knows about all this. His numbers have been plunging in the polls because Reform Party is taking away from him a lot of votes, certainly in polls. And he wants to salvage that. He's in power for another few years, but he's looking ahead. And this is his motivation. It's not based on reality. Certainly isn't based on genuine foreign policy considerations, and it certainly isn't based on morality.
So you're basically, just to conclude this conversation of ours, you're basically saying that in parallel to the physical war, right, on multiple fronts, Israel is waging a political warfare against it, right, and fighting back. To what extent do you think that one might even be more threatening? Because as we have discussed this morning, the superiority, including a moral one, right, of the Israeli Defense Forces is unparalleled. But how well are we faring vis-a-vis the political warfare, which seems to be so sophisticated and so well spread? How well are we doing?
Well, as many of your viewers and listeners will know, and supporters of NGO Monitor will know, This political warfare campaign began in the mid-1960s, and it began in the Soviet Union with the Soviet Union wanting to use Israel as a weapon against the US and the UK, the dominant powers in the region at the time. And therefore they turned what was a religious war by the Muslims against the Jews into a war of national liberation, invented the Palestinian Liberation Organization, put Yasser Arafat and then Mahmoud Abbas in power. And that campaign, beginning right back in the mid-60s, has just accelerated. And Israel and Israel's supporters are very, very heavily outnumbered. It may not be a political warfare campaign that can be won by Israel, but nevertheless it's essential to fight it, because some people can be influenced, including political leaders and significant activists can be influenced by the truth. And I would say that the way to do that is, well, you don't need me to tell you this, because NGO Monitor is a key player in this. And getting the truth out there, making sure that the truth is exposed and then made known to people of influence, whether it be political leaders, journalists, university authorities, international organizations, that obviously helps. It doesn't necessarily win the war, but you can lose the war less badly if you make sure that the truth has got out there. But the reality is, unlike in warfare on the battlefield, on the 7 fronts that Israel has been fighting, where Israel has prevailed, substantially prevailed in each case, Israel does not have the same, let's say, political warfare power as it does military warfare. But like I said, we have to keep fighting. We have to keep resisting this, because of course Israel could say, well, we can ignore all this stuff. It's just noise, but it's not just noise. Israel has to live in the whole world. Fortunately, there's the most important country involved in this conflict outside of Israel is the United States of America. Unfortunately, the US has an administration now that I think is on the right side. Mm-hmm. And that we saw that proven really with their intervention in the Iran conflict with the B-2 bombers and submarine-launched cruise missiles. So that's the case now, but it's not necessarily going to be the case forever. We don't know what administration will replace the current one, and therefore we have to fight as hard as we can to get the playing field more level than it is now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything that you do, for always being the voice for Israel and for the truth, and for never wavering at speaking out and being here. And thank you for being one of our supporters. And to all of you, thank you for joining us. We will definitely keep fighting and we'll never surrender, because we only have one state and we only have one home. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for our next episode.